Although the sinking of the Bluebelle had drawn national attention, things began looking grimmer for Terry. By the third and fourth day, journalists and the Coast Guard weren't expecting survivors would likely be found. Harvey had taken his time getting back on his dinghy after fastening a motor to it. He wanted to make sure that child was dead. Although he likely believed Terry probably was dead, he was paranoid and anxious, especially when he was almost discovered the first time he killed a wife. Harvey wasn't found by the Sea Lion ship until a day later, just a few miles from the Stirrup Cay lighthouse that Terry would pass by later. Some crew would later say he looked like he was trying not to be seen when he was picked up, but then changed his mind. After Harvey began lying and telling his story that the Bluebelle was wrecked by a sudden squall, a rescue team was immediately launched. Coast Guard Lieutenant Murdoch and Captain Barber were put in charge of the investigation. 2 cutters and a pair of Coast Guard aircraft began searching for survivors. Ships were also notified. Commercial planes regularly flew above. But nobody saw anything. The cork blended too easily into the whitecaps. Based on Harvey's story of where it went down, he claimed it was closer to where he was picked up, near the lighthouse. Murdoch and Barber would search the beaches looking for debris, but they couldn't find anything. In the meantime, Terry Duperrault was dying, and she was floating farther away from land, not towards it. Her cork was moving towards the British Isles, though she would have been long dead, and her raft disintegrated before she could have ever reached there. She had been terribly hungry, but by now that had abated into semi-unconsciousness. Her thirst was even worse. Under conditions of hot sun and splashing salt water, most adults will succumb to death between 2 and 4 days. Many of the sailors during the sinking of the Indianapolis, floating in their life jackets, hadn't lasted as long as she had on that 3rd day. It's easy to become confused and break in the grips of hallucination, especially with so much water around you. She saw more and more islands with single palm trees, and imagined herself swimming towards them, but she resisted. That 4th day came. Her legs were also cramping to the point it hurt just to move her muscles. And although it was only 85 degrees, the direct glaring sun hitting her skin nonstop made it seem much hotter. And it was for her. The sunburn made her flesh sting like it was on fire. Terry was traveling through a nightmare, none of which made sense. Her old life had been ruined by the selfishness of a single man, who, at that moment, was lying to the Coast Guard about what happened, and even at times blaming the Duperraults for a disaster that he was making up. But something made Terry stronger than Harvey, something that he could have never imagined. Her parents were dead, but they had left her with a gift, a strength that even Harvey could never have fathomed. Through their love, their survival teachings, and by keeping her physically active, playing sports and pretending to be Tarzan swinging through the jungle, they gave her a powerful will, a strong, healthy body that preserved her through the harshest elements, and knowledge of what not to do, even when it was what she wanted. Her parents were dead, but what they left with her wasn't, and it was that gift which caused her to survive when everything around was trying to destroy her. Terry Duperrault kept struggling, kept living, and on that 4th day, somewhere in the distance, she heard voices. Voices that at first she thought was just another hallucination. This time they weren't. The years had taken their toll on Harvey, emotionally. That guy he was when he was younger who said he wanted to go into the Air Force because that's where all the glory was, who would take chances, who thought he was invulnerable, that wasn't Harvey anymore. He had failed at relationship after relationship. He was financially a failure. He couldn't control his spending. He was very angry and vitriolic. And by the time the Bluebelle came around, he was much more vulnerable. When he was discovered by the Sea Lion, the crew were divided. Some gave him money and presumed he was in shock. They felt sorry for him. Others were suspicious. "He don't seem to care that much. There's something off about him," a crewman said. The Bahama authorities felt the same way when he started asking, "Have you found any more corpses?" rather than, "Have you found any more survivors?" Psychopaths have a lot of trouble showing genuine concern. They're always acting, so they oftentimes will seem a little bit off when they're trying to pretend to show they care. Dennis, who had discovered Harvey while on watch from a poop deck, was immediately suspicious. He recollected a few days later about seeing Harvey in the mess hall after they picked him up. "You know, there are some people, you just look into their eyes and you might look right down into the depth of them. Well, I looked at him just about like that. It was like I could look clean down into his body and soul. And I just thought to myself, something is kind of wrong here." Julian Harvey was scheduled to be interrogated by Lieutenant Murdoch 4 days afterwards. He was to stay in Miami. He spent the nights with his friend Boozer, John Boozer. Boozer said Harvey seemed very depressed. He felt like a loser, not the hero he once had been. He didn't tell Boozer why he was depressed, that he had screwed up something really big, homicide. Instead, he began talking about suicide and claiming contradictory stories from what he had told the Bahama authorities. He said a fire had started and that he had fled like a coward. Of course, that's not actually what happened, but that's what he said. And Boozer and his son, Harvey actually had a son, unfortunately, because he was going to screw that son up, Lance, both believed him, and they were very concerned about Harvey. November 16th came. That's 4 days after the Bluebelle sinking. It was 9 a.m. when Lieutenant Murdoch met with Julian Harvey. When Lieutenant Murdoch met with Julian Harvey, Harvey wasn't under suspicion by the U.S. Coast Guard. This was just a general inquiry. Harold Pegg, the owner of the Bluebelle, was present. They both exchanged cordial greetings, although Harold Pegg would grow more and more irritated as he heard Julian Harvey's story because he had had the Bluebelle inspected. But Murdoch was immediately put off by how excited and eager to get this over with and what good spirits Harvey was in. That's not the type of attitude that somebody who just lost their wife is usually in. They're usually very despondent, especially with on top of losing the Duperolts as well. So that kind of put him off. But he thought maybe he's just in shock at first. The following are the actual transcripts of the interrogation, of which I'm going to go through part of this episode. So this is Julian Harvey's actual words. During the interrogation, his stutter came back, so I'm going to include his stutter as I act out him being interrogated by Murdoch. And Murdoch, as you will notice, becomes more and more suspicious of Harvey as it goes on because the story is absolutely absurd. "Do you want the full story?" "Definitely," Murdoch replied. So from here, Murdoch begins scratching on his pad as he leaned back in his swivel chair and listened to Julian Harvey. He didn't know at this time that this is the third boat that Julian Harvey had lost in about the last 6 years. "When we left Sandy Point, the weather was good. There was a fresh breeze coming up, about 15 knots. At night, I always travel with reduced canvas. I had the staysail up and the mainsail up. I did not have the mizzen or the flying jib up. Under this sail configuration, the Bluebelle could easily carry 25 or 28 knots of wind without heeling over uncomfortably. She could carry more than that. In other words, that was a very safe, conservative sail plan. About halfway between Sandy Point and Great Stirrup Cay, because it had such a pleasant sailing with no power on. Everyone was in the cockpit. It was big, a roomy cockpit. The children were there with some minor bedding and were napping. Then this small squall hit us, and a monstrous thing happened. In 20-knot wind, the main mast failed 1/4 or 1/3 of the distance above the deck. It was not a failure of stays, it was a failure of the wood in the main mast. A 50-foot length of the main mast came hurtling straight down, piercing the deck like it was made of paper. It was just like a telegraph pole going straight down on the deck. It tore through 1-inch white pine of the deck and continued on down through the bottom of the hull as it gained momentum. The stays from the mainmast to the mizzenmast gave a gigantic pull to the mizzen, break it in at least 2 places. It collapsed. Among us in the cockpit, this collapse of the entire rig reduced us to a bare hull wallowing in the sea. Fortunately, no one was hit directly, but my wife and Dr. Duperalt were cut on the legs by splinters. I was steering at the time, and I started the engine and left it at slow ahead to give us control. I briefly checked the wounded and told everybody to sit fast and not panic, that I was going forward to get the cable cutters and get rid of all the cables around us. I ran forward, clearing my way through the debris, went below in the forecastle, and finally got the cutters. Emerging from the forecastle forward, I saw a fire had started in the cockpit, and because the wind was down the deck, fore aft, the 6 passengers were moving aft away from the flames. I remember them taking some of the boating cushions after them. The children already had their life preservers. As they were standing on the rear deck, the fan failed behind the cockpit, very close to the gasoline tanks. I was naturally in deadly fear of an explosion. I ran below, picking up 2 5-pound fire extinguishers. The water was already a foot deep in the hold, coming through the hole made by the mainmast. The boat was wallowing in the water, was rushing backwards and forwards, making it hard to maintain footing. The passengers astern could see me doing this, and they apparently decided among themselves to jump overboard and wait for me to get to the boat back to them rather than stand there facing the fire in that area. They had confidence in me. I cut the rail with the cable cutters, bent the stanchion, and managed to launch the loaded sailing dinghy without swamping it. I could hear faint yells, although we were going into the wind and they were downwind of me. I tied the raft and dinghy together and rowed to the stern. It was pitch dark and I could see nothing in the water. I had a carbide water light, but it didn't work and I threw it overboard. By this time, the Bluebelle had gone down very quietly. As she sank, the fire went out. There was never a huge general fire, just in the cockpit and stern areas. I was so exhausted, it was all I could do to get the little girl up in the lifeboat. I tried artificial respiration on her. The sea was building up. I tied the little girl's body in the rubber raft by myself. Then I must have stayed in the area 2 hours before giving up hope of finding the others. After that, we drifted until about 6:30 in the morning. I kept shouting. It was cold at daylight. I opened the emergency rations. I could see that I was faced with a problem. The wind was from the southeast, and I was afraid that I might drift in the Gulf Stream. So from the first, I rationed the food. The sun came out and warmed me up, but I was continuing doused by the waves. The sun, by the time, was up in the neighborhood of 8, 9, or 10 combers, and the wind was steady, 20 knots. The tops were hissing. About 1,300 hours, I saw a large steamer coming directly towards me, about 5 or 6 miles. At 3 miles distance, it veered off to my left and missed me by at least a mile. However, I was told that one man on the stern saw me. They turned, came back alongside, and picked me up. They fed me and treated me for mild shock, radioed the Coast Guard in Miami, and proceeded to put me off at Nassau. Murdoch was skeptical. How could a mast pierce a deck like Harvey claimed it did? Broken masts usually didn't work that way. They usually plunged straight down. and then broke into pieces and tumbled overboard. This didn't entirely make sense. And if the Bluebelle had caught fire, as Harvey claimed, why didn't the lookout on the high Great Stirrup Cay lighthouse notice this, considering that Harvey said that the Bluebelle went down only a few miles away? Nobody saw any lights that night. Also, why didn't he travel over to the Great Stirrup Cay lighthouse so that they could radio and help, instead of worrying about whether he would drift into the Gulf Stream? He was an experienced sailor, after all. Yet, there wasn't any evidence that he was lying directly. Did you call, or at least attempt to call, for help by radio? Harvey replied, "When the main mast went, it took the antenna." So you made no attempt to use the radio? I knew it wouldn't work. I didn't even attempt it. It would have been a waste of time. Didn't you have any flares? I did have flares in the emergency kit in the raft, but they were way down in the kit, and they weren't easily available. Frankly, I just didn't think of them at the time. Even the greenest sailor knew to use flares right away, and Harvey was saying that he didn't think to use the flares when there was an emergency. That was one of the first things they taught you. Why didn't you hoist the sail on the dinghy? Harvey replied, The wind was too strong, and I was exhausted during the night. In the morning, it would have been swamped because I was towing the life raft. The dinghy, by itself, could have done fairly well, but with something to tow, it would have gone under or over. The wind was so strong. Murdoch thought. Now, this carbide water light which you threw overboard, did you pull the plug on it? Harvey responded, I could see nothing to pull. I'd been told that all you do is put it in the water. I just threw it overboard. Murdoch was stunned. This piece of equipment was extremely easy to use. Any sailor could use it. Captain? How much experience do you have sailing a craft of this type? Murdoch asked, surprised. Funny enough, Harvey might have downplayed his competence, but it triggered some narcissistic element in him, his old ego, and he sat upright and said angrily, I have owned and operated craft of this type since 1954. I've sailed extensively in the Bahamas. His reputation was still important to him, even when he was being interrogated. And by his own account now, it was clear that he was an experienced sailor. At that point, Murdoch was a little more suspicious than he had been when Harvey had come in. But there was still nothing that could legally tie him to homicide and deliberately sinking the ship. And there was a strong chance Harvey was going to get away with another murder. At the same time that Harvey was being interviewed about what happened, a Greek freighter, Captain Theo, on its way from Belgium to Houston, sailed through the tumbling waves of the North Providence Channel. Second Officer Nicholas Spakadakis was on watch, standing on the bridge. A few other ships could be seen far away, but there was nothing unusual at first. Then Nick squinted curiously at a whitecap a mile distant that didn't vanish like the rest. What is this? Debris? He thought. Probably not. It's kind of large. Must be a fishing dinghy. Wait. This is too far out for fishing. Captain Kusodontis, a large, swarthy man, came over, and they looked out at that one white cap that was different than the thousands of others. Moments later, they were both stunned. Astonishment covered their features. Like out of a fairy tale, incomprehensibly, a little blonde girl appeared, waving feebly, bobbing into view on her cork, her emaciated face covered with sunburn. By now other sailors had congregated around and were shouting in astonishment. Somebody snapped a photograph. Meanwhile, the captain, quick-thinking man, began assembling a life raft. They didn't have much time. Large sharks had finally taken notice of Terry and were circling around her. Whatever had kept them at bay for so long wasn't working any longer. The life raft was made of oil barrels and lowered over the side. A sailor arrived to scoop up Terry. Not a moment too soon. Not only were the sharks about to attack, but only a few hours later her cork was seen demolished by a heavy wave. Although a large, heavy-set man, the captain was as gentle as Harvey was cruel. He scooped Terry up into his arms and took her to a place where she could lay down, giving her something to drink with a sponge because her lips, her mouth was so tight and dehydrated that she couldn't drink water normally just yet. Then the captain coaxed her into speaking. "Can't you tell me your name and how you found yourself in the water?" the captain asked. "I want to report you to the Coast Guard that we have found you. If you will tell me your name, I can send information to your relatives that you are still alive." Terry weakly shook her head. "No." "You can't be sure they are lost. Maybe some other ship saved them." Terry shook her head weakly again. "No." She pointed her thumb down towards the water to signal that her relatives were gone, swallowed by the ocean, and then hoarsely managed the word, "Bluebelle." The whole world was about to find out who Terry Duperrault was, and that Julian Harvey was lying.